The Fifth Estate.
Good evening. I'm Hannah Gartner. Tonight we tell the story of Jane Stafford. As a battered wife, she took the law into her own hands, and the law responded with firmness and with compassion.
I hate to have to think how many other women are out there, even this minute, that are living that same fear. And how many kids are being abused, and they just keep it all behind their closed doors. I don't think there's a day that I don't get up, that thought don't go through my head. I wonder who and where right at this minute that's happening to.
One night, 2 years ago, Jane Stafford decided she had had enough. Things were not going to get better. 5 years of hoping and trying were at an end. Now was the time to make a decision. Jane Stafford made her decision by picking up a shotgun. The brutality that Jane Stafford suffered at the hands of her husband, Billy, that both she and her children suffered, was not all that unusual. Jane Stafford was lost somewhere in the statistic that 1 Canadian woman in 10 is the victim of physical abuse by her husband. Even the details of Jane Stafford's life, as shocking as they may seem to most of us, are the commonplace of wife battering. Mindful of this, public and private groups in many Canadian cities offer counseling, transition houses, refuge. If they were available to Jane Stafford in rural Nova Scotia, she had never heard of them. In a single moment of desperation, she forged her own solution. As unacceptable as that solution is, at least she had made a decision. And shotgun in hand, Jane Stafford walked into Canadian legal history.
Queens County lies midway between Halifax and Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The livelihood of its 13,000 people depends largely on the changeable fortunes of the fishing, lumbering, and paper-making industries. One of the county's biggest towns is Liverpool, with a population of 3,500. In contrast, Bangs Falls to the north is just a dot on the map, with a population less than 20. But a lot of people know about Bangs Falls because it was the home of Billy Stafford, a man most people feared and stayed away from.
I don't know, ever since I was a little kid, all I ever heard was stay clear of Billy Stafford, so his reputation ever since I can remember has been none too good.
Billy Stafford stood over 6 feet tall and weighed 250 pounds. He often bragged that he once drowned a fellow fisherman by throwing him overboard. The man's death is officially listed as a suicide. Billy was once charged with mutiny for threatening a fishing boat captain and forcing him to shore. Billy was blacklisted in the fishing industry after that, but the charges were dropped because no one would dare testify against him. Billy Stafford was particularly well known to the RCMP detachment at Liverpool, where Peter Williamson is staff sergeant.
He was a very obnoxious individual. He resented the law. When a summons would be given to him, he'd just tear it up and leave it there and then say, if I go, I go. We have to act on a complainant, and then that complainant has to go to court. And the people were scared to go to court.
Billy Stafford once had a wife and 5 children, but he so brutalized them they fled to Ontario. Then a common-law wife ran even further to get away from him. She moved to Calgary. Jane Wynot, on the rebound from her own disastrous marriage, left her youngest son Jamie with his father, and she and her eldest son Alan moved in with Billy Stafford in 1977.
He was a real charmer when I met him. He could be a gentleman.
What was it about him initially that attracted you to him?
The strength, probably. Not just the physical, but I thought about it a lot of times, and I wonder.
Jane didn't marry Billy, but she took his name, Stafford, and they had a son, Darren. Billy wanted a girl, but Jane could have no more children. This was the turning point in Jane's life with Billy. He began beating her and abusing Darren. He wanted to teach Darren to be a man.
He could laugh when he was told. He could talk when he was told. The crying was the biggest thing. He was never allowed to cry.
He didn't cry even when he was struck?
He didn't cry. Like through the middle of the night, as any baby does, he would cry time to get up and feed him. Well, from the time he was 6 months old, Bill used to go to the crib, and I'd never hear another word, but I wasn't allowed to get up and go there. And I used to wonder all night long, was he dead? Was he alive? Am I going to get up in the morning and what am I going to see? Because there was never a sound came out of there.
What did he do to him?
I don't know.
Billy Stafford ran the house like a prison with a strict set of rules. Darren wasn't even allowed to enjoy Christmas. Billy opened the child's presents for him and would taunt him, sometimes keeping his new toys from him for several days. At the Stafford table, you even had to eat the way Billy wanted.
When we sat to the table, like Darren couldn't even hold a cup in his hand. He couldn't, without spilling it, like he would shake so bad. Mealtime was a big, it was just so full of hate at our table. Darren had to eat at the same speed as his father did. And lots of times he couldn't do that. So Bill would take the spoon and just keep shoving it into his mouth. And Darren would vomit right on the table. And Bill would just take his plate and scrape the vomit in the plate and keep on feeding him until it was gone.
When you're all sitting at the table and Billy is making Darren eat his own vomit, what were you doing? How were you reacting?
Well, I had tempted before to say I didn't agree with this, but then I just get knocked on the floor. It was just constant abuse, like a slap or a kick. That was just something that was ordinary every day. You knew that was...
Every day?
Yeah. But there were really real severe beatings, and some that, the one that in particular, I lost my teeth, and
How did it happen?
with the barrel of a gun. I was knocked unconscious a lot of times.
One night, Billy knocked Jane out and left her unconscious on the kitchen floor. Her son Alan found her there but couldn't revive her.
He thought I was dead, but he couldn't turn on no lights or make any noise. Feared he'd wake Bill up. And he had to go to bed, not knowing if I was laying there dead or alive.
Sometimes Billy shot at Jane to see how close he could come without hitting her.
And it was just within inches. Like the ground would fly up or it would be over my head. Or the one morning I was up filling the stove and he was in bed and he just fired right out through, and it just went out through the wall just slightly above my head. I mean, I could have stood up. If I'd have stood up at the time, I'd have been dead. He often said, like, he was possessed by the devil, like, that was his power. That was, and there was no such thing as the Lord or anything.
How did you protect yourself? How did you keep from going crazy?
I think it's from way back in childhood. I think you start building your barriers, and as time goes on and things, they either get better or worse for people.
Jane was the second oldest of 4 children. Her father was a career army man, and the family moved around a lot. As a child, she often saw her mother abused by her father.
My dad drank a lot, and it was a lot of problems in our home. Mom took a lot of the physical, emotional, and all. And
He would actually hit her?
mm-hmm.
Did you ever talk to your mother about it?
You don't talk about those things. They degrade you, and you just don't figure it. Other people live like that. At the time, I guess you think you're the only person that is living like that.
When you were a young girl, what kind of a man did you imagine that you're going to meet, fall in love with, and marry one day?
I guess everybody got their dream about the guy that comes driving in, you know, and The white knight. That's every girl's dream, but it never happens generally.
Jane's family was living in Winnipeg when she left home at 15, headed for an early, unhappy marriage.
Ended up pregnant and married and 16. So,
How long were you married?
10 years. And 2 kids later, we went from the pan to the fire.
The fire was to be her violence-filled home life with Billy Stafford. His wrath wasn't restricted to Jane and her children. His own parents and his sister and her children saw a sample of it when they came over for dinner one night.
For some reason, he just went berserk and took everybody's plate and threw everything in the garbage. And he got the gun and brought it out, and he hit Kathy's boyfriend side the head with the gun, and the kids, her kids were screaming and crying, and Kathy was, and everybody just got in the truck and left.
Jane's father, Morris Hirschman, moved back to Nova Scotia with his wife when he retired from the Army in 1977. He got to know Billy Stafford and sometimes drank with him.
We were having a few drinks, and I don't know what I said, something jokingly, and he went just like he was crazy, like a madman. He frothed from the mouth, he hit me, knocked the window out of the house, he kicked the door, drove a hole through the door, broke the latch off the outside door, and right into a rage, just as quick, that quick, you know.
Billy found another victim when Ronald Wombolt moved in as a boarder at the Stafford house. The two were drinking buddies, but that didn't stop Billy from beating him from time to time.
Billy Stafford was very mean.
Wombolt's estranged wife, Andrea, is Jane Stafford's close friend. She knew what Billy was like.
I have seen him many times cruelize his kids, like throw knives at them, pick them up by the hair of the head, throw them across the floor, spit in their face, pick them up by the feet, hold them up like this, shake them. And
Did he frighten you?
yes, he did. At one time, he put a gun at my head. Jane and I was sitting at the table talking. This is when I went to Toronto and come home on vacation. And we was just talking, and he went to bed. He was drinking. And we was talking there for a while, and he come out of the bedroom just like a wild man. Brought the gun out and pointed it right at my head. He said, "You're just like Pauline," he says.
His first wife.
Yes. He said, "Leaving your husband," he said. So, and then he grabbed both of us by the neck, Jane and I, ripped my sweater and long hair. So he told me to get out, so I got out. And after that, I guess he put a licking on Jane, quite a bad licking.
So you knew Pauline, you knew his first wife,
Yes.
and he wasn't any different with her than he was
No,
with Jane?
he beat her, she put her in the hospital. He beat her so bad. She was in the hospital. She was pregnant at the time. And she had to crawl out the house in a snowstorm. I mean, I went through the same thing with my own husband.
Your husband beat you too?
Yes, that's why I left him. That kids.
Are you telling me there is nothing that can be done for women like
There's
you,
no
women
protection.
like Jane, women like
There's no
Pauline?
protection whatsoever for women that's being beaten.
You've got to live with it.
Either that or leave. I left because my kids told me to. And like Pauline had to leave, or he would have ended up killing her. So, and like he told Jane, I heard him say different times, "Old woman," this is what he used to call her. He said, "Get it out of your head." He said, "Don't think you're leaving me." He said, "Because I'll kill you."
For the first while, you think that things are going to get better, you know, and then you sort of go through a stage that you think, well, this must be my fault, you know. Every day I was told it was my fault. So you kind of believe it after a while that it is.
What was your fault?
Why you got beat, why you got hit, he had some reason why. And for the longest while, then you start believing it.
So he threatened, if you ever leave?
He told me that, like I did tell him this one time that I was going to leave, and he told me that if I ever left, he told me that I would come back because he said I would kill your family one at a time until you did. He said, and then I'd deal with you when you came back. He said, you're the third one, he said, and I won't be a third-time loser.
You believe that?
You're darn right I believe that.
So at that point, you knew that you weren't going to get out?
Yeah. I knew I'd die here or he'd die here, one of us would. It's like, it was just, you give up. Like, this is the way it is, and you make the best of it.
For Jane, making the best of it became impossible. Billy Stafford seemed more and more depraved with each passing day.
Did you have a normal sex life with Billy?
Till after Darren was born, till everything else started happening, then that was no more normal. It just went from bad to worse to bizarre.
Can you talk about it?
I had to talk about it at the court. Some things I can't. Probably the worst thing is having sex with a dog. That's what. We had a German Shepherd, a big dog. And I was made to do that.
You never screamed, you never cried, you never yelled?
Who's going to hear you here? Nobody. You're just alone.
No one, not Jane's family, friends, neighbors, or police, knew the horrible secrets hidden inside the Stafford house. But they all knew that Billy was terrorizing his family, as he had terrorized them. Yet no one even tried to help Jane Stafford. Were you aware of how he was treating Jane?
No, not really.
You never saw Jane when she had black eyes and she was black and
Well,
blue?
Jane, she used to, well, she wore dark glasses and stuff like that a lot. But like I say, I didn't know that this was going on.
Because
you know, if she had a bruise or something, I'd say, well, how'd you do that, Jane? I don't know. I don't bumped it or something.
did her mother worry? Did your wife ever discuss it with you? What's wrong with Jane?
No. Like I say, after I seen what Billy was like, I never came around that much.
Well,
I didn't even care, you know. He'd come down to the house after that sometimes, and I used to be scared just to hear him come in the yard.
well, if you were frightened of him, frightened of the sound of his arrival, and you saw your daughter black and blue, I mean, as her father,
Yeah, but I
it
mean,
never occurred to you to take your daughter out of this environment? You weren't worried for her? If you were worried for yourself?
Well, like I say, I thought they got along all right. I didn't know that they weren't getting along all right. Jane never mentioned it to me. I guess if it would have got out, well, he'd have probably killed her for sure.
When you two would sit in the kitchen, have coffee, and talk to each other, what did you tell her? Did you advise her to leave Billy?
It's easily said and done. You got a lot of things to think about. You're scared, you got kids to look after. You don't know where you're gonna go, who's gonna look after you, and then she had a fear of him. When you got a fear, you know it's a hard thing to do. And she was scared of Billy.
We didn't have a complaint from anybody. Knowing what's going on and being able to prove it are two different things. We know lots of things that go on in the area, but unless the evidence is there to substantiate it, you just can't go to court with it.
Did you ever think of taking your own life?
Oh, yeah. I considered that. Then I thought about Darren being left here with him. I considered that. And I said, hell no. Maybe I could do it for myself, but not for Darren.
Jane Stafford ruled out suicide, but she was so terrified she once offered to pay a man in a nearby town to kill Billy. Then she thought about doing it herself.
I didn't want nothing less than him being killed. He'd pass out, and a couple of times I just picked up the gun and put it on him. But I guess maybe Darren, the kids, they would have to see this. They'd already seen enough in there. I just couldn't. It was just...
On March 11th, 1982, Billy and his friend Ronald Wombold spent most of the day drinking. They came home for supper, after which Billy ordered Jane to drive them to a nearby town to continue drinking. All the way there and back, he threatened to burn out their neighbor, Margaret Jodrey. They often fought over her legal right to the property adjoining his.
When we went out, he told Ronnie to take the gas off of the back of the truck, put it in the shed. They were just going to take the gasoline and pour it over her place down there and just burn it down with them in it. And knowing the place, they never could have gotten out. And he just raved on and on.
Billy also screamed that he was going to deal with Jane's 16-year-old son, Alan, who often stayed away to avoid Billy, but he was home that night, and Jane feared for his life. By the time Jane drove them home, Billy and Ronald Wombold were very drunk. Wombold stumbled into the house and passed out. Billy was asleep beside Jane. It was one of his rules that she was not to move until he woke up.
Everything just sunk in, you know, what's going to happen when he comes to, what it's going to be. And I just beeped the horn, and Alan came out to the door, and I just told him to get the gun and load it. I just took the gun and put it in the window and just pulled the trigger. And I told Alan. Alan came back out. I met him by the door, and I just told him what to do, to take the gun down to Margaret's and get rid of it.
Alan took the shotgun to Margaret Jodrey's trailer. He broke it into 3 pieces, took it to the Bangs Falls Bridge at the bottom of the hill, and threw it into the fast-flowing Medway River. Jane Stafford was dazed and blood-splattered. She got back into the truck and drove off with Billy leaning against her.
And I left here, and I went over the road and just drove. I don't know how I drove that road. I drove it. And I just got to the end of the gravel road, and I just stopped the truck, and I got out.
Jane had told Alan to call her parents and have them pick her up near where she left the truck. She told them not to ask her anything and just do what she wanted. They drove her first to their home where she cleaned up, and then to the Bangs Falls turnoff. From there, she walked home through the woods. The truck was discovered the next morning where Jane had left it. Billy Stafford was dead. Most of his head had been blown off by the force of the close-range shotgun blast.
I didn't believe he was dead. Like, I know when I got out of the truck, I left the keys and everything there. To me, he was going to drive back home. I didn't know he was decapitated until I read it in the newspaper. Nobody ever said, and I never asked, and I never knew. I never saw anything.
Did you cry when you were told he was dead?
No. No.
When did you cry?
I can't say as I have.
Jane Stafford was arrested, but Staff Sergeant Williamson told fellow officers he thought she deserved a medal and probably saved 1 or 2 RCMP officers' lives.
I came to my own opinion that he was a nasty individual. We would go out there sometime if he was under the influence of alcohol or whatever, and he would, no doubt in my mind, would have shot one of us.
A plea of guilty to manslaughter was offered, but the Attorney General's office in Halifax said no. Prosecutor Blaine Allaby.
Basically, the facts that were apparent to the Crown before trial was that it was first-degree murder. It was planned and it was deliberate.
Alan Ferrier, a defense lawyer from the Bridgewater office of Nova Scotia Legal Aid, represented Jane Stafford.
Clearly, she hadn't thought things out, because any woman who would have thought things out with the history that she had there could easily have lied or made up a situation, and it's doubtful that anybody would have disbelieved her.
In November 1982, 8 months after Billy was shot to death, Jane Stafford went to trial before a judge and jury. She was charged with first-degree murder and faced a 25-year prison term. She arrived in court with her sister Mona, a social worker from Ontario, who flew in to be with Jane. The trial was held in the quaint old courthouse in the town of Liverpool. It attracted a lot of local interest. One of the jurors at Jane Stafford's trial was Daniel Smart, who works at the Liverpool hardware store.
When she was on the stand, it was very emotional. It was very hard to sit and listen to, because she said some things that people shouldn't have to say to other people.
The trial lasted 19 days. The address to the jury by Justice C.D. Burchill took 7.5 hours. The jury was sequestered overnight. Its decision came at 11:30 the next morning. It had 4 options: guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, or not guilty at all.
Did she plan to murder him? That was the question, first-degree murder. And there was no way it was proved to us that she actually planned it.
The verdict was not guilty. Jane Stafford was acquitted, and courtroom spectators applauded and cheered. A happy and relieved Jane Stafford, with Darren and her father, went to the Halifax airport to see her sister Mona off. She and Darren soon followed her to Ontario to start a new life, but her ordeal was not over. The Crown appealed the jury's verdict. The Nova Scotia Supreme Court in Halifax upheld the appeal, and in December 1982, a new trial was ordered in the case of Jane Stafford. Although Jane Stafford had been battered for almost 5 years, Billy was asleep when she killed him. Cumulative provocation is not accepted as a defense under Canadian law. The appeal court ruled the defense had stretched the meaning of self-defense, and it said the presiding judge had misdirected the jury. Jane returned from Ontario, took the for sale sign down from her house, and waited. Determined not to sit idle, she continued to upgrade her education, enrolling in a nursing course. Darren was also in school, and in the evenings she helped him with his homework. Jane tried to create as normal an environment as she could by eradicating the memory of their life with Billy.
I made a big fire outside in the fireplace. And everything that was here, that was his, or that he had done, I burned it. I just burned and burned and burned. It seemed like forever. There's been a different feeling in this house, like peaceful.
February 14th of this year, Valentine's Day, was set as the date for Jane Stafford's new trial. But rather than put her through the torment of another lengthy trial, defense lawyer Ferrier offered, as he'd done 2 years earlier, to enter a plea of guilty to manslaughter. This time, the Crown and the court accepted. There would be no trial, only sentencing. The night before she was to plead guilty, Jane Stafford packed her bag, as she'd done for her first trial, and did her best to explain the situation to Darren. She didn't know when she'd be home again. The courtroom filled quickly as Jane Stafford arrived in the morning. A pre-sentence report was favorable, but presiding judge, Mr. Justice Merlin Nunn, said a message must be sent to other women in Jane Stafford's situation.
Do you have a few words for us before you go in?
He sentenced her to 6 months in prison and 2 years probation. He recommended she be allowed to continue her education.
Jane, can you give us any reaction to the decision today? How are you feeling?
Jane was escorted from the courthouse by the Queens County Sheriff and driven off to jail. She was glad it was over and was willing to go to jail rather than appeal and drag it on for another year or more.
Jane has paid a heavy price over the last 2 years, and certainly well before that in the life that she led with him. But the route she took is not the answer. She, as the judge said, acted as judge, jury, and executioner.
Jane Stafford is allowed to drive to school each day from her cell at the Halifax County Corrections Center. She could be released as early as next month. Darren, meanwhile, is living with his grandparents while he waits for his mother.
I suppose hindsight does no one any good at all, but if you knew then what you know now about Billy Stafford, about Jane's life with him, what would you have done?
Well, I'd have probably went to the police myself and see what I don't know what I'd have done. I don't honestly know.
Were you so frightened of him that maybe you would have you would do exactly what you did do? Nothing.
I probably would have.
How do you live with that?
It's hard. It's hard.
Well, what kind of advice do you have for other Jane Staffords who are living in this area?
If you're afraid of retribution, then leave the immediate area. If she wanted to come to us and make this complaint, we would take the action, but she would have to give the evidence, and that's the whole crunch. If we didn't convict him and she returned to that environment, then she knew what would happen.
Did you ever think to yourself, as horrible as your life with Billy was, did you ever think about taking a shotgun, putting it in the window of a car a few inches away from your sleeping husband's head and blowing that head off? Did you ever think, what kind of a woman are you that you could do such a horrible and hideous thing?
No, I can't say as I have. It was just something that happened right then. I often wonder, will I ever trust? Am I capable of loving somebody? They're going to know. Are they going to be disgusted or...
Are you afraid? Worried about your judgment?
Who you'd pick? Another Billy?
Makes you wonder. Because I don't think you ever really know people. Maybe that's the distrust and the resentment that's there. I know there's a little part of me that nobody will ever know, and I know everybody has it. And it's you, and you're going to hang on to it no matter what. And it's just something that'll take time.
So easy to say that people in those circumstances should just leave, but frightening how difficult that would have been for her. What about these halfway houses for battered wives? Would that have helped?
Perhaps the halfway house could have helped Jane Stafford if she could have gotten out of her own house. But I think she felt that it was hopeless, that any help that she could find 2 hours down the road in Halifax was non-existent when those around her, friends, relatives, the police, did not come to her assistance when they knew she was in trouble.
In that case, it seems that the jury is redefining its notion of self-defense. Is that having any change in the law?
It has not changed the law yet, but it just may, because there are more and more cases like this one, where juries are listening to the litany of horrors that these women suffer over the years, and they are coming to the conclusion that they were provoked.
Everything just sunk in, you know, what's going to happen when he comes to, what it's going to be. And I just beeped the horn. And Alan came out to the door, and I just told him to get the gun and load it. I just took the gun and put it in the window and just pulled the trigger.